Welcome to today's debate. I am Kevin Juanu, president of the Concordia Christian Union, and today's debate is the first event in this year's Spiritual Life Week, which is co-sponsored by the Concordia Students Association, the Concordia Christian Union, as well as the Concordia Philosophy Club for today's debate. Our debaters today are Concordia's Professor of Philosophy, Dr. Jonathan Strand, and also, Concordia Sessional Professor of Philosophy, Paul Beach. Now, topics are, a precise topic is important in any debate, and today's topic is rationality of belief in God. And specifically, it's the question, which is more rational, theism or atheism? Belief that God exists or belief that God does not exist? The concept of God being used in this debate is that of a being that is unlimited in power, knowledge, and moral perfection, and is the ultimate cause of everything else that exists. So theism is the view that everything that exists has a single ultimate cause, unlimited in power, knowledge, and moral perfection. And atheism is the view that there is no such thing. The format of the debate is that each speaker will briefly introduce themselves and frame their arguments to follow. Then each will give opening statements, respond to each other's arguments, and make closing statements. The floor will be open for questioning at the end of today's debate at about 12:50. So I'll invite the speakers to come up and introduce themselves.
My name is Jonathan Strand. I've been a professor of philosophy here at Concordia for more than 20 years, and I've loved it. One of the things I've loved about it is that as a faith-founded institution, we're perfectly free to say what we think and talk about the really big questions in life and argue about them, and we have people of all kinds of different backgrounds in the classroom, and we can argue with each other, and I've loved that. And it's okay, socially okay to do that here. In fact, it's encouraged to talk about the really big questions in life. And so we're hoping in this debate to continue that tradition. So I believe in God, and I believe that God reached out to humanity in a special way through the person of Jesus. I also think that those beliefs are quite rational. In fact, believing in God seems to me to be clearly more rational than disbelieving. But two clarifications before we just start the debate proper. First, I had great fun creating the poster for this debate. I hope the event itself doesn't disappoint you in being, not really being so much an event of rhetoric and theatrics and antagonism. On the contrary, Professor Beach and I have gotten along very well for many years and respect each other's point of view. The purpose of this debate is to honestly confess to each other and you how we say things and why, to enhance all our understandings. Second clarification. It's natural for people to assume that whether or not belief in God is rational settles whether you ought to believe in God. I don't actually think that's true. Rationality is not the final arbiter of all things, ethically in particular. And though I believe God relates to us through our rationality, I believe that God relates to most of us more in other ways. So I respect the strong tradition among philosophers and theologians that says we ought to believe in God even if it isn't rational. But nevertheless, when I think things through for myself as a philosopher, I come to the conclusion that belief in God is rational, and in fact, it seems to me more rational to believe than to disbelieve. That's just how it comes out for me. Professor Beach sees it differently.
Hi, folks. So let me put on my comically large glasses so I can see my notes. Funny that the world is so intelligently designed that it's too small for most people to see clearly. So I'm Paul Beach, soul-crushed middle management bureaucrat by day, mind-nurturing Socratic philosopher by night. And I am an agoblinist. By that I mean I don't believe in the existence of little invisible goblins that hide under the beds of naughty children. I don't believe in woodland fairies either, or demons, or ghosts. Oh, and I don't believe in any sort of God of any kind. I'd like to welcome you here for the debate. I trust you're here with open hearts and open minds to talk about the rationality of belief. Dr. Strand believes that belief in God is rational. I do not. If we're to be candid, the underlying question between us will always be, you're intelligent and well-educated. Why don't you understand me, and why don't you disagree with me? For over a decade, Dr. Strand and I have tried to explain our perspectives to each other, each convinced that once our arguments are properly understood, assent will follow. Alas, we have both been left frustrated. So like good philosophers, we have decided to share our frustration with you today. Let's get ready to rumble!
So, I believe that belief in God is rational in three ways. It is evidentially rational because God's existence is highly probable given many pieces of evidence that we observe. It is pragmatically rational because it helps us have better lives. And it is experientially rational because of the experiences I and many others have. So belief in God is evidentially rational for two reasons. First, there's many things that we observe in this world which are much more to be expected if we assume that God exists than if we assume that God doesn't exist. And the second reason is that assuming that God exists provides the simplest possible explanation of all this evidence. Consider the existence and nature of the universe, the way it's composed of, filled with galaxies and stars and nebula and quasars and planets and down to things like kind of our size, composed of molecules, composed of atoms, composed of subatomic particles, the whole world of fields, and all of that governed by laws of nature. And then consider the diversity and complexity of life on Earth. Watch planet Earth. Next, consider that there could be no universe like this or living things like us unless the laws of nature were just what they needed to be to make that possible. Next, consider the way the universe is filled with beauty. And then consider the existence and nature of human beings like us, who live lives, who can love each other, who can do good things for each other and with each other, who can do things that make a real difference in the world, can even affect people for generations to come. And consider our consciousness, our awareness, that we're not just complex physical things, but we actually have complex thoughts and feelings. And then consider our ability to perceive the values of things, how we see that some things are good and other things are bad, and some actions are right and others are wrong, and live accordingly. Now, I want you to ask yourself two questions. The first question is, think about all that, the universe, the life, the human beings, all of that. How surprising is all of that if you assume that God exists? How surprising is it? And then ask yourself a second question. How surprising is all that if you assume that God does not exist? All these things strike me as not particularly surprising if I assume that God exists. Creating an amazing, complex, beautiful universe containing living things like us who enjoy the universe, who can love each other, have lives that matter, who perceive what is going on, can discern good from bad and right from wrong, and can live accordingly. All that seems like the sort of thing that God would be able to do and would have good reason to do. But if I assume that God doesn't exist, All this strikes me as very surprising indeed. I ask, how the heck did that happen? So these things are much more to be expected if you assume that God exists than if you assume that God doesn't exist. By the principles of scientific reasoning and even probability theory, then, all this evidence is evidence supporting theism over atheism. The evidence is more to be expected assuming God than not, so it supports theism. More than that, supposing that God exists provides the simplest possible explanation for all this evidence. Theism supposes that everything is ultimately caused by one thing, not many different things, not an infinite regress of things, but one thing with unlimited power. Not a certain amount of power, so much power, no more, but unlimited power. It's an incredibly simple concept. So theism provides the simplest possible explanation of all this. Good reasoners, and this is especially obvious in science, always favor the simpler over the more complex theories and hypotheses. The simpler the theory, the better. The simpler the overall view, the better. So because the evidence available to us is much more to be expected, assuming God than not, and because God provides the simplest possible explanation, theism provides the best explanation. So the evidence strongly supports the existence of God, and belief of God in God is evidentially rational. Belief in God is also pragmatically rational because it's conducive to a good life. It can help us see that we and our lives actually matter. It gives us a basis for well-founded hope, and it helps us live more rational or more moral lives. So if God exists, God knows everything, and he knows it forever. So we and what we do have infinite and eternal significance. We and our actions are known by God forever. If there is no God, on the other hand, I and what I do have limited significance. I can do some things to help other people. I can do things that have an effect on future generations. But assuming no God, in the end, the effects of all those things will end relatively quickly. Certainly when the universe ends in heat death, there will be forever no trace that we ever existed or did anything. So on theism, our lives, what we do have infinitely more significance than on atheism. There's also far greater basis for hope, assuming that God exists, than God doesn't. God would be able to preserve us spiritually and resurrect us physically after our physical deaths. In fact, one would expect God to do that, given God's power and goodness. One would expect God, in the end, to put an end to all the suffering and evil in the world, and even to help me become what I ought to be. When things go really badly in this world and for me, if I believe in God, I can rationally believe that this isn't the end of the story. Life isn't a story with a permanently bad ending. When I think of a young child who has suffered and died, a child who's been raped and murdered, if I believe in God, I can believe that that child isn't just out of luck. That child can still have a wonderful existence. If there is no God, on the other hand, it looks vastly more likely that when any of us die, that's the end. We cease to exist, and there is no final justice in the world and no hope for murdered children. So belief in God helps us have a well-founded hope. Finally, belief in God can help me in my endeavor to become a better person. God would presumably want to help me in this quest. And if I believe that this physical life isn't all there is for me, and my actions actually have permanent significance, it makes sense for me to sacrifice for others. This is much more difficult for me to rationalize if I think this physical life is all there is for me. It would be much more natural to think I should grab for all I can in this life for myself. Sacrificing for others is much more difficult to rationalize. There would be no God to help me with this effort. It's less obvious that trying to be good would even be worth trying. So belief in God is pragmatically justified for giving us confidence that we matter, what we do matter, that there is hope, and that it can help me live more morally. Finally, belief in God is experientially rational. Human beings know things through the experiences that they have, okay? So I know that the part of the floor here is, I think it's green. My wife always corrects me. I'm always wrong about what color it is, but I think it's greenish color. Okay, how do I know that? I'm having a certain visual experience that tells me that. I'm having an experience right now that tells me that I had breakfast this morning, a memorial sort of experience. I have an experience that tells me that 1 + 1 = 2, etc., okay? Like many others, I also have experiences that cause me to believe that there's more to this world than meets the eye, and in fact that there is a God who loves us. When I am moved by music or a good movie, amazing sky or the mountains, these experiences feel like I'm perceiving the significance of things beyond anything I can make sense of in terms of just physics. In fact, when I read and hear certain things, for example, when my pastor is preaching on a Sunday morning, I have the experience where it seems to me that I perceive the Spirit of God speaking to me. Now, I could come up with alternative explanations for that, but given the other reasons to believe in God, the other evidence, it also seems perfectly sensible for me to take these experiences at face value and take them as involving real perceptions of things relating to God. So believing in God seems to me to be far more evidentially, pragmatically, and experientially rational than disbelieving.
So it has always struck me as a little weird having to explain the rationality of atheism. To be clear, atheism is not a set of beliefs. It's not a doctrine demanding unwavering faith. It's not a mysterious promise or an ancient Near East mythology. It's simply the coherent rejection of a certain body of unsubstantiated fictions. I reject theism as I reject zodiac astrology and any medical advice based on the theory of the 4 bodily humors. Asking an atheist to defend his doctrine is a little like asking a non-smoker, why did you decide not to become a smoker? What could the answer be other than, well, you know, I was breathing normally and saw no compelling reason to stop doing that. And notice the oddity of labeling someone a non-smoker anyway, as though they should be described as someone not making a ridiculous life choice. Maybe you should refer to them rather as healthy breathers, and by analogy, start calling atheists rational believers. Now, following Strand's basic format, I will claim that belief in God is not rational for 3 types of reasons. First, theism lacks sufficient evidence. In other words, there's no good evidence to suggest the existence of God. Second, God fails as an explanation. What I mean is that postulating the existence of God fails to properly explain experienced phenomena. And finally, theists are inconsistent. The reasons that you all reject the belief in other gods and religions than your own should consistently be leveled against your own. So let's start with the first one, evidence. I do not think that it is rational to be a theist for the very simple and uncomplicated reason there's no good reason to believe in God. This is the same reason every atheist I know declines to kneel before an unanswering sky god: lack of evidence. Sadly, atheists do not have glamorous origin stories. We don't get to have epiphanies. We're not born again. We don't get filled with a Holy Ghost. We don't get bitten by radioactive spiders. We have to make our judgments about the validity of theistic claims based on a stunning lack of supporting evidence. Now, what evidence could possibly convince me that there's a loving creator God? Some would claim that most human beings throughout history and in the world today believe in some sort of divinity, so there must be some truth in it. But it should be pointed out that cherished beliefs of the hoi polloi are often horribly mistaken. Humanity has displayed such prevalent and enduring ignorance concerning, for example, the morbid belief in haunting ghosts of dead relatives, in the fantastic belief in the maleficent powers of witchcraft, and the oppressive belief in the inferiority of women. Belief by the credulous masses is not a testament to the truth of a belief. And as the current political phenomena of Donald Trump indicates, it's quite often the opposite. The earth is not flat. Schizophrenia is not possession by demons. Lightning is not punishment for wickedness. And gods do not exist. Now, some would claim to have direct experience of God, so I should at least consider it possible. I do not consider such claims as objectively valid evidence. I reject it on the grounds that there are natural causes for these purported epiphanies. For example, if I fast for 3 days on my vision quest and speak to my spirit animal, it merely indicates, it does not prove that there is a God. It merely indicates that malnutrition can cause a person to hallucinate talking to grizzly bears. That's my spirit animal. The rapture of a starving prophet has perfectly mundane causes. The subjective, internal, mysterious experiences of God are easily explained by natural causes. The apocalypse of John is just the result of eating too much pizza right before bed, or the effect of fever on a malnourished brain. The divine voice in your head is probably undiagnosed schizophrenia. That feeling you get deep down inside when the pastor sermonizes is equivalent to the feeling a gorilla gets when the giant silverback hoots and beats its chest. And, besides this, no one has direct sensory experience of God. By all accounts, it hasn't been seen or heard from in years. So none of the usual sources of rational belief assent are available to the theist. There are no testable claims, no direct sensory information, no unique experiences. Just the certainty resulting from childhood indoctrination, coupled with the moral imperative to never question their faith. Those are not rational grounds. Now, there are some things we rationally believe without direct experience, like gravitational forces or atomic particles. We do not intuit them directly with our senses, but rather we postulate them in order to explain what we do experience. We witness objects falling with regularity, so we posit an invisible force, call it gravity, to explain it. Now, some would argue that the belief in God is rational in this same way, that theism has explanatory power. I contend that as an explanatory hypothesis, God is a failure. Therefore, believing in God is scientifically equivalent to still believing in the heat-generating properties of phlogiston, or the animating force of the vital force, or the causal efficacy of magic. A rational explanation must thoroughly explain past and present phenomena, reliably predict future phenomena, it must be testable, and it must itself be, in principle, explained or explainable. The God hypothesis fails in each of these essential functions. God does not enable us to predict future phenomena. You see, gravity doesn't fail. Valence electrons behave as predicted. But God, as we are to understand it, may or may not answer prayers, may or may not appear to prophets, may or may not clarify commandments to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. What we know about God in this hypothesis is that we can't know anything useful about God. A mysterious cause, remember, is not an adequate scientific explanation. A cause that cannot itself be explained is not a causal explanation. So postulating God to explain something is really just conceding, I don't know how it happened. Finally, I find theists to be inconsistent in their application of the criteria required for rational assent. They hold the religion somehow to be an exception to the scrutiny of reason. So let me put it another way. Everyone in this auditorium today is an atheist. I'm just a more consistent one. If Dr. Strand were raised in the 9th century Norway, I bet he'd be arguing the evidential, pragmatic, and experiential rationality of belief in Odin the Allfather right now on a longship in the North Atlantic. If he were born in Cairo, he'd be up here proclaiming the rationality of Allah instead of Jehovah. No one in the room today thinks it's reasonable to worship Odin or Zeus or Quetzalcoatl, Ogma, Cernunnos, Ahura Mazda, Perun, Aten, Shangdi, or Mukaru. But why? In other times and other places, people believed in these gods just as strongly as you do today in yours. They were just as certain. They were just as blind to reason and just as irrational. So be honest. Why do you reject the truth of those other beliefs? Is it the morality that they espouse contrary to contemporary values? Spoiler alert, so is Christianity. Is it that their fables or scriptures revealing these gods, do they seem strange, ridiculous, or contrary to basic understandings of science? Hate to say it, so does the Bible. Is it that you just have no compelling evidence to warrant belief in Mukaru or other fictional entities? Well, now you can understand my incredulity. If you are to be rational and consistent in your beliefs, you will realize that the reasons you reject Wicca or Scientology or fundamentalist Mormonism or the Hare Krishnas are the same reasons you should reject your current iteration of theism. Become an atheist. It's intellectually liberating.
The allegation that there's no evidence for the existence of God, I would just refer you back to my initial statement. Evidence for something, observations are evidence for a hypothesis whenever those observations are more to be expected if that hypothesis were true than if it were not. And if all this is much more to be expected, assuming God, than assuming there is no God, then all this is evidence for God. It falls right out of the probability calculus, actually. Secondly, about what I said about experiences of God and that sort of thing. I actually wasn't using that as an argument for the existence of God. Some people have, obviously, a lot of people have. What I was saying is, for people who have that kind of experience, it's perfectly rational for them to understand it that way and to take those experiences as telling them things about reality. Let me use an example. First, this simple example, going back to the visual example. I know there's stuff going on in my brain when I'm seeing the floor, but it wouldn't make any sense to say, well, I can explain, there's light waves going into my eye and stuff is happening in my brain, so therefore you have no real reason to believe there's a floor. No, what's going on in my brain physically causes me to have mental states that actually reflect the reality out there. Think about ethics, actually. We have I think our emotions tell us things about what's good and what's bad. Goodness and badness are not perceivable by the senses, right? They're not detectable by any physical machines or instruments. But we perceive it nonetheless. We have experiences that tell us that that's really bad and that's really good. So these experiences reflect a reality out there if you think there really is such a thing as good and bad. What I'm saying is it's perfectly rational for me to believe that my experiences that seem to tell me about a significance of the world beyond what physics can deliver, and in fact things about God, it's perfectly reasonable to take those experiences I'm having as reflecting a reality out there, namely God. To the charge that this is all childhood indoctrination, well, that's a slanted way to put it. You could also say, well, this is just good education, right? To the point about, well, if I was in my ancestors' shoes in Norway, I would believe different things. Sure, I'm sure I would. I don't see that as relevant, however, because, of course, if Professor Beach hadn't had the opportunity to study philosophy, he wouldn't believe hardly any of these things that he's saying today. So what's relevant isn't, well, if I were in some different situation, I would believe something differently. Sure. What's relevant is, well, what is the evidence? Now, to the Professor Beach's statements about what's required for a rational explanation, I think what he's given 4 criteria that I think are clear exaggerations. The first was they must thoroughly explain past and present phenomena. Well, no explanation explains everything, and in fact, as Thomas Kuhn and many others have pointed out, any scientific theory, there are always what they call anomalies. There's always things that don't seem to fit the theories, and then the scientists are continually trying to solve the problem. That's always true. To the criteria that any good explanation must reliably predict future phenomena, and they must be testable by making predictions. Well, that is certainly the ideal in science, but I'm not really caring whether my theistic explanation is called a scientific explanation or not. I don't care about that. But many of our explanations, good explanations, explanations you absolutely believe are not, do not have that predictive basis. The fact is, most of our knowledge of history is not based on predictions. We look at the evidence we have, and then we make sense of it by positing a theory to explain what we already observe. It's not by making predictions. And even in science, it's that way in many cases. Most of the case for evolution is not based on making predictions. It's based on observing what we already see and then saying, well, this is how we can explain it. So even in history, in our everyday life, and in many cases in science, explanations are accepted on the basis of what's already observed, not on the basis of predictions, though prediction is sought in science. Then Professor Beach said that any good explanation, no explanation is a good explanation unless the thing cited as the explanation also has an explanation. That's an impossible standard because you quickly get an infinite regress. Okay, if I have to explain this in terms of something else and I can't do that unless I have an explanation for that, well then I have an explanation for that, an explanation. I have to believe in an infinite number of things. It's impossible. We can't do that. And in fact, scientists never do that. They'll posit the existence of a subatomic particle to explain something they're observing, and they don't say, well, okay, we can't do that unless we have an explanation for them. They don't do that, right? Furthermore, it seems to me that God is the natural stopping point for explanation. There's 2 crucial differences between the concept of God and the concept of Odin and all those mythological creatures and gods. The concept of God we're talking about here is that God is unlimited in power and is the ultimate cause of everything else that exists. All those other things, those mythological creatures, are limited in power, even if they exist. They're limited in power, and they're not supposed to be the cause of everything else that exists. And that makes all the difference. Because for any of these limited things, we can always say, yeah, but why do they exist? How do I explain that? And if I have a multiplicity of gods, or simply a multiplicity of things in physics, there's the puzzling question, well, why this complex menagerie of gods or all this complexity in physics? How do I explain all that? If I can trace it all back to one cause, it has an enormous simplifying effect on my overall understanding of reality. And you see that this is what scientists are always going for. They're going for theories which can explain a variety of observed phenomena. And if they'll posit physical laws, and then they'll explain moreover broader laws to explain them, and then broader laws, and the ultimate goal in physics is a grand unified theory, right? One law of nature to explain it all. Well, that's what I'm doing. I'm saying, look, it's more rational, it's more scientific to say there's one ultimate cause of everything than that there are many, or that there's an infinite regress, or that, well, there just isn't one. I'm just using the broadly scientific reasoning, taking it to its logical conclusion. The next thing I want to tell you about is Professor Beach hasn't really used the argument from evil against God, but we all know that's the best argument against the existence of God, and he'll present it in a bit. But I'm going to just preempt that. The evil in the world seems to count powerfully against the existence of God because the evil, all the bad things that happen in the world don't seem to be what you'd expect if there were an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good God. Now, very important, I am not minimizing the evil in the world. It is really, really, really bad. In fact, I think it's worse than any of us know. I really believe that. Of course, I think there's also a lot of good that's more than we know, but it's really, really bad. However, when I think this through, it seems to me that the evil in the world isn't as unexpected, assuming God, as you'd initially think. First, God would have to permit evil in order for us to have truly significant lives. To have a significant life, what we do must make a difference. In other words, we must have the power to make the world significantly better or worse by doing good or evil, by facilitating, by fighting good or fighting evil or facilitating evil. If God were to prevent all evil, that would massively reduce the significance of our lives and our actions. It makes sense to me that God would want to create creatures whose lives really matter. In order to do that, God must allow the possibility of evil. Second, for us to have significant lives, the world must be governed by relatively stable laws of nature. We must be able to know from experience what the results of our actions will be. If God continually stepped in and made sure the best thing always happened in every possible situation, we would never know what was going to happen next. We could never say, well, if I do this, this is going to be the result, because I would never know what the result would be. And actually, I would have no ability to choose what would happen in my life at all. I would have no freedom at all. So, to enable us to have significant lives, God must permit the world to operate in a regular way. He cannot continually be stepping in to prevent all evil. Third, God can use the bad things that happen to teach us things and to improve our characters. Fourth, you notice that the evil and the suffering that we experience is limited. Okay? It all ends sharply in death. I don't suffer anymore when I die. And of course, most people who believe in God, because it's natural that God would want to do this, would give us a life after death. I actually, if this life were all there was for us, I actually think the argument from evil would be decisive. I really do. But it seems to me that God would give us a life after death where He fixes everything, and so the limited amount, really bad, but still sharply limited evil that we experience in this life comes to an end. Perhaps the most important point, though, about the argument from evil. By hypothesis, God knows everything. Okay? So now think about this. How likely is it that God would have reasons for doing things that we don't know anything about and maybe couldn't even understand? When I think about that, I think that's what I would predict. that God would do things, permit things that I would have no clue about. So, on further thought then, it seems to me that the evil in the world is not much less to be expected assuming God's existence than assuming God's non-existence. So the evil in the world counts very weakly at best against the existence of God.
All right, harken back to his original arguments. I'm going to try to refute them now. So Dr. Strand makes three basic claims: that theism is evidentially, pragmatically, and experientially rational. So let me briefly explain how these claims are sadly mistaken. First, evidentially. How a person can look at the world and deduce that it must have been created by a loving God has always baffled me. By moral standards, the world is obviously cruel, callous, and unfair. But to show the absurdity of Strand's evidence, let me employ his method and then leave you to answer his question. What things? How surprising is it, he asks, that there is a world containing such things if I assume that God exists? Let's look at some of those things. Whole galaxies are daily being destroyed. Solar systems that possibly support life like our own are burning out into the coldness of space, and ours will eventually too. Most of the planet's surface is uninhabitable by us, right? Not very finely tuned in my experience. Our lifespan is not adequate to overcome our ignorance, even in those rare instances where we're trying to. Our sensory organs are inaccurate, and the data processing functionality of our brains even more so. There's no justice in the universe, especially among living creatures. Our ability to recognize and act according to values leads to war, cruelty, hatred, vice, and unnecessary suffering. We're afflicted with Alzheimer's, congenital cancer, encephalitis, famine, drought, war, painful death, painful childbirth, leeches, genocide, lice, the Jersey Shore, malaria, autism, depression, baldness, STDs, UTIs, PTSDs, migraines, hurricanes, cancer. Okay, obviously I can list the horrors of world endlessly, but with these in mind, I dare you to answer Strand's question. How surprising is it that there is a world containing these things, presided over by a loving God? To make your life significant, Strand says, children must be born with cancer and die a horrible death, so that you can matter. Let me ask a follow-up question. If you're satisfied that a God exists who would permit this kind of suffering, why would you worship it? Pragmatically, this is his second point, it's clear that Dr. Strand's claim to pragmatic rationality is really just proclaiming the benefits of a rational belief. Now notice the unspoken element of what he claims. Believing in God will make you happier, even if it's false. But this proves a little too much, because any shared belief will have the same benefits. For example, my son is a brony. Espousing the claim that friendship is magic has the benefits of making him feel that his life matters. It gives him hope for a better future, and it gives him reason to act morally. Brohoof. The same can obviously be said for non-theistic religions like Buddhism, for secular movements like the Society for Creative Anachronism, and for crazy cults like Scientology and those awaiting to ride the Hale-Bopp comet. The fact that these beliefs make you feel fulfilled does not make it rational to believe that you're actually a knight or filled with alien phaetons. Finally, experientially, Dr. Strand claims that he directly experiences God. But if you listen carefully to the content of that experience, you'll notice that it's not experience he's talking about, but rather the habituated, superstitious interpretation of an otherwise common experience. When he cries at a movie or gawps at a mountainscape, but is not immediately able to make sense of his complex feelings, he has been trained to think no further, but say inwardly with a smile, God is present. This is not evidence of divine presence, but rather a lack of scientific curiosity. There are natural scientific explanations of the effect of a sunrise on the human emotional brain functions. But Strand will never care to investigate them. He already has an answer: God. The mechanisms of cinematography and soundtrack that are carefully orchestrated to elicit pity in an audience by a crafty filmmaker are irrationally interpreted instead as feeling touched by the hand of God. Faced with confusion concerning the cause of his feelings, Dr. Strand is comfortable attributing them to a supernatural entity. This is not rational explanation, but rather stifling doubt with a comforting superstition. He's not experiencing God, he's experiencing normal human emotions, but interpreting them within the archaic framework of a bizarre doctrine.
So very briefly, of course, I think Dr. Beach is characterizing my pragmatic argument as this is, I'm justified in believing things that are irrational. Of course, I'm denying that it's irrational on the basis of evidence, and I think the evidence matters. It matters that I have evidence in favor of God, and I don't have evidence for Odin and other things. Okay, right, I don't have evidence for those things, so the evidence really matters. Imagine you're in a situation where you can't really settle the truth, right? It's not obvious. Suppose that you have a missing child, and that missing child could be dead or could be alive, and suppose it's a situation is you just won't know. What would be rational to believe? I think it would be rational to be optimistic and to believe your child is okay. I think that would be more rational than to believe positively that your child is dead, if the evidence is ambiguous. So I believe that if you look at the total evidence we have, all that evidence is more to be expected assuming God than not, so that's evidence for God. And I think the hypothesis that everything that exists has one ultimate cause, that's unlimited in power, and therefore unlimited in knowledge, and therefore unlimited in moral perfection, is the simplest possible explanation of everything. So it is evidentially rational to believe that. If you want to know more, I would suggest you take some philosophy. I'm going to be back in the classroom next year, and I would love to teach you, and Professor Beach would love to teach you as well, I'm sure. Even more, we have a conference coming up in the beginning of May. We have a Center for Scholarship in the Christian Faith, and this year's conference the theme is Atheism in the Christian Faith, and we are having, my own belief is that this man is the best person in the world on arguments for the existence of God. Oxford philosopher Richard Swinburne is going to be right here, May 6th and 7th. Come and hear from the master. I will confess that the foundations of most of my arguments came from him. So if you want to hear the real deal, and oh, by the way, if you're an atheist and you disagree, write a paper and submit it and present at the conference. So come in May.
All right, final thoughts. Belief in God is not just irrational, it's dangerous. Besides motivating people to perform unspeakable acts of cruelty, theism and the unscrutinized faith it demands prevent such obvious human goods as gender equality, birth control, healthy sexuality, and stem cell research. But given we're talking today at a university, I want to caution you about the danger theism poses to your intellectual curiosity and pursuit of understanding. The specter of God has ever cast its shadow over gaps in the human understanding. Religion began to afflict humanity at a time when those gaps were vast. Credulous and frightened ancients explained sickness and famine and inclement weather as evidence of a wrathful God. Why is this happening? God wills it. This explanation, let me scare quote that. This dumb answer, this irrational assumption, prevented a more robust investigation into the natural causes of disease, into agricultural practices, into weather patterns and meteorology. This perpetually stupid answer to our questions about why things happen as they do condemned us to suffer unnecessarily through whole ages of human history, and in some cases to unlearn hard-won lessons in the ignorance of faith and righteousness. As rational investigation and scientific reasoning slowly determined clear, testable, predictable explanations of natural phenomena, God retreated into these ever-shrinking gaps. The supernatural mystery claimed by theism, however, continues to block up those gaps in human understanding. Where we should question, we answer God. We have the opportunity to use our minds to diminish the causes of human suffering if we would but be liberated to use them. But by allowing the myth that theism is somehow rational to persist, that these ancient revelations are anything other than fairy tales to keep our fear of death and the unknown at bay, we are placing an unnecessary impediment to free thought and scientific curiosity for the next generation. To paraphrase Bertrand Russell, it is possible that humanity is on the threshold of an enlightenment, but if so, it will first be necessary to slay the dragon that guards that door, and that dragon is theism. As Dr. Strand claims, theism provides an answer to life's great mysteries, but it is a mind-numbingly bad answer, an answer rational persons should reject in order to look further, dig deeper, and understand the world more profoundly. Thank you.
So my question is for Dr. Brand. I wrote it down so I don't get nervous. You spoke of the argument of evil and how when you die, this suffering ends. So that was your justification that, if there's evil in the world, we know when we die, it ends, and that makes life more significant, all the stuff you said. My friend sitting next to me, we both kind of looked at each other. Evil ends when we die, but not for those that go to hell?
Right. This is there was a couple times in Professor Beach's presentation where we actually had a discussion about, well, what God are we talking about here? What's the scope of the debate? And so the debate is really about, is everything caused by one thing that's unlimited power, knowledge, and moral perfection? It's not about Christianity. And so, we could have another debate about Christianity, but that's really beyond the scope of this debate.
Well, but you did employ the afterlife as part of your argument.
Oh, that's right. Because the concept of God that we're talking about would lead you to expect that. Okay?
So expect hell as well.
Maybe. I don't know.
That's a problem.
Well, but you would only expect hell if it was rationally justified. So if you think it's not rationally justified, then you wouldn't expect it.
Sorry, just because...
So, and then it could be used as an argument against Christian belief.
Because it was my question, though. You're saying it's rational to expect hell? So an eternal punishment for something that was done in a 100
my point
year.
is, if just starting with the concept of God that we're talking about here, okay, if that would lead you to expect hell, then it would, if it would lead you to expect hell, then that would not be an argument against what I'm saying, okay? It would not be an argument against Christian belief.
But you're arguing that suffering and evil is justified in this world because in the afterlife there is no suffering and evil. That was what you argued.
I said that that the evil in this world comes to an end, and it can be rectified.
Unless it isn't.
In the next life.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, Mr. Bus.
I've been waiting like 10 years for this debate, and you guys... have not disappointed. I have one question, but it's aimed at both of you, because I think it challenges both of you. Newtonian physics is wrong, but it was once rational to believe in it, because it was at that point the best explanation. And by believing this thing that ultimately is not true, we were able to advance to something better. So my question for both of you, that I think challenges you differently, was it rational to believe before climatology that Thor was the cause of thunder and Zeus was the cause of lightning? Now here's why I think it's a challenge to you. Dr. Strand, if you say yes, it was at one point rational to tentatively hold as a hypothesis that Thor was the cause of thunder, shouldn't that leave us sort of humble about positing God as the cause of everything, because we've known that that hypothesis hasn't panned out in the past? And if you say sort of like no, well, it wasn't rational, even before we had a better explanation, even when that seemed like the best explanation, we shouldn't have believed in Thor, what criteria would we have that wouldn't also apply to the Old Testament God? And Dr. Beach, if you say, well, no, even when there was no better explanation, we should never have believed in Thor or Zeus, why would, even as a hypothesis, not as like something we settle on, because you said, well, it stops scientific advancement. Well, if we said it as a hypothesis, for now we believe in Thor and Zeus. If you say, well, no, they never should have believed in Thor and Zeus, well, then your claim that you're just a neutral, I just don't have beliefs, is false. You have a positive belief in materialism that precedes any evidence, which is dogmatism. And if you do say,
is there
well,
a question here?
Yeah, there is. You say if you say, well, yeah, back then, it was rational to believe in Thor, but now we know better. Well, aren't you in that boat now? Right now, it's most rational to believe in God. It might be refuted later. So that's my question for both of you. Was it at one point before climatology rational to hold that Thor and Zeus were the cause of natural phenomena?
Okay, so my answer to this is quite easy. It matters how you believe it, right? So I think believing in Thor as the cause of thunder, as long as you took it the way I believe in atomism right now, which is test it, right? I'll believe it as long as there's no evidence to the contrary. And as soon as that comes up, I'm looking for something else, right? Now, it might have been that way for Christianity in like 200 BC, I don't know, but it isn't that way now for Christianity. So it has fallen by the wayside as a reasonable
because
hypothesis.
we discovered suffering a few years ago, or what? Like when did we find the evidence that refutes that has invalidated Christianity?
Oh, I think as soon as we came up with anything like, almost anything that you put in there, like virgin birth, or the idea of the sun standing still.
So we only discovered after Christianity that virgins don't generally give birth.
Well, once the philosophers got involved, they pointed it out, but then they spent their time trying to justify and rationalize, rather than scientifically investigating alternatives, which is what reasonable people do.
All right. And Dr. Strand, would you have believed, do you think it was rational to believe in Thor before climatology?
Yes. I think our what's rational to believe is dependent on the situation we are in, the evidence that's available to us. I think lots of people over history have quite rationally believed in lots of different things that we now think they're wrong. And I absolutely think we should hold our beliefs in such a way that we're open to further evidence. When you characterized belief in God as if it's sort of the end of all inquiry, I just strongly disagree with that. I want people to do philosophical research the way Professor Beach does it. I want the physicists to work on the Big Bang and try to explain why that all happened. I'm all in favor of all that inquiry. And if you look at, I also think what you're saying is not an accurate representation of history, because all these developments basically happened in a Christian context, right? So, okay. So the debate today was about, is it rational which is more rational, to believe in God or to disbelieve in God for us right now? And that's what I believe. I think it's rational to believe in God. It could change, but we are where we are, and it's not rational
Fingers
to just
crossed.
say, well, it could change, so therefore stop believing anything.
So what you're saying
Right.
is there's hope for you.
There's hope for you, Paul.
My question is for Dr. Beach. For a while, my knee is excellent now. It's never been better. But for a good 3 months, I was having trouble walking. And someone prayed over it, and it miraculously instantly got healed with a snap of my fingers. My question is, how can you explain that through atheism?
Well, I mean, there's all kinds of really good reasons why your pain might go away, right? And they're easily demonstrable by medical science. But the question really comes back to you, which is, there's a lot of people dying of diseases right now, and they're not getting cured. People are praying over them like crazy, and nothing is happening, and nothing will. Let's be honest. Those kids are gonna die. They're gonna die. And so when you say, like, just imagine you're that kid who's got a family of 30 people praying over them, and he's gonna die anyway, and you come walking up and say, but my knee's better. That's like a big F you to this poor kid. Like, seriously, you can't believe that God healed your knee. Can you?
Yes, I can.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
I can. Yeah, no, I admit, I'm a Christian myself, and what I was looking for was a rational explanation from you to see why it got healed with a snap of my finger.
Well, I'm sure if we had a medical doctor up here, he would talk about spontaneous remission and all kinds of interesting things about why your pain went away. It might have been that you just, pinched a nerve. I don't know. There are very mundane answers to that.
Yeah, no, I've gone to medical doctors and...
Yeah.
Okay, can I say something and then we'll get to the next question? I think you're revealing a really surprising certainty about a certain point of view that all of those reports of miracles are false.
They are,
I think
absolutely,
that's astounding.
I believe that. I absolutely believe that.
I want you all to appreciate the strength of that claim, okay? He knows right here that none of those things
Look,
are
if
true.
you told me that
That's
God
amazing.
talked to you right now, I would be remiss if I didn't get you to see a psychiatrist. Absolutely remiss. You agree with that, right?
No.
If you're hearing voices,
Well,
there's
you're
something
presuming
wrong with
things.
your
Well,
brain.
I don't hear voices. But
Okay.
Okay, I have a doozy for you, Professor Strand. So we've been talking about metaphysics, particularly what's called ontology, dealing with beings, how beings exist in relation to each other, and that sort of question. And at some point you did bring up the question, because we've been centrally talking about the being of God, a being that has been described as one having infinite knowledge. And yet at the same time, you seem to be talking about our ability to have free will, our ability to act morally nonetheless, except that at some point you did talk about God being having knowledge, and if we define knowledge as justified true belief, the classical definition, that means that he has a truth notion of what's going to be happening now, in the past, and in the present. How do you reconcile the claim that we can act morally when this is already fated?
are you saying if God knows what already knows what we're going to do, how can we?
Yeah. Is there a notion of hard determinism here? Essentially, because God knows that's true, logically it should follow that essentially everything is already settled for. That there's no space for us to act freely upon, to be moral, as you seem to be claiming.
So it doesn't follow from knowing ahead of time what somebody's going to do that they are not doing it freely. I could actually observe. Well, maybe I should just leave it at that. Suppose God. I mean, I'm not saying that this is not mysterious. Okay, but suppose God knows the future. His knowing what I will do is knowing that I will freely do that. Right? It's not his or something else determining that will happen. It's the traditional way of doing this is to say God is outside of time, and so God sees every moment of history at the same time, what is for us past, present, and future.
So if he sees every moment, since he's outside of time, you seem to be claiming, doesn't he know what I'm going to do then? He knows that I'm going to act, but shouldn't he also know what I'm doing, what kind of action I'm taking upon?
Yes.
Yeah, so ultimately, since God is already the being that contains all these kinds of truth claims, how can there be any sort of free space for anyone to act freely? I'm just confused about this question, to be honest.
Well, knowing that something is true isn't making it true. It's reflecting what's true. So the fact that God knows what a person will do doesn't mean that God is making them do that. God just knows what they're doing.
All right.
The causation...
So we cause a change in God, is what you're saying?
So
Our actions cause a change in what God
I'll
knows?
just confess that there's lots of perfectly sort of the more orthodox philosophical theologians would be having difficulties right now with
The
what I'm
hallmark of
saying.
a good explanation is that it's mysterious at root.
yeah, like I decided to put a tough question.
Causation. The world is full of mystery for you too. Causation,
But I'm still looking.
Causation. So am I.
No, you already have
because
God. You have
believe-
God as your answer. It's like, I don't have to look anymore. God explains that.
I never do that, right? I don't just. Well,
Also,
I
Professor
agree
Strand.
that I shouldn't do that, but I also deny that I do that.
Okay, and leaving the question of free will, there's also Occam's razor, which you constantly brought up throughout your argument, namely talking about the simplest explanation. But there's actually, as far as I'm aware of, two ways of rendering Occam's razor. Whether we're talking about the smallest amount of entities, and or like the most simple entity, God, as you would explain, or reduce it to kinds of entities, rather. Why would we prefer one way of looking at Occam's razor over others? That's the last question I have for you.
Okay, what I think is that it's a huge. The basics of what I'm about to say is totally uncontroversial, namely that simplicity is a huge factor in scientific reasoning, that scientists, and we actually everyday life, favor simple explanations over more complex explanations. Now, what kind of simplicity is at play? That's a big, ironically, there's a lot of complexity to what simplicity is. It isn't just the number of entities, however, because as Newton posited the existence of gravity, a universal force of gravity, to explain phenomena that we observe, the motion of the planets, the things falling on Earth. He added to the ontology, but because it explained a multiplicity of things, it won the day scientifically, right? So what I think is what matters most is the overall simplicity of the total point of view. And that includes how many things there are, but it also includes how simple or complex the concepts are. I'll let Professor Beach talk now.
Oh.
But I mean, you got this. The overall, I think theism provides clearly the simplest overall point of view.
But keep in mind, simplicity is not the unique criteria. And so I could explain all reality by blob. And if I can't tell you what blob is, or blob is mysterious, that's a bad explanation. Very simple. It covers everything. Any question you ask me, I could say, blob did it. Blob willed it. But if I can't tell you what blob is, it's a bad hypothesis. And God sounds like blob to me. Sorry.
That's why one of the first thing I said is very important, that it leads you to expect what we observe in the world. And that's why the problem of evil is the strongest argument against it. Anyway.
So first of all, I want to thank both of you for the debate this afternoon. My particular question is directed towards Professor Beach. In response to Dr. Strand's evidential argument, you responded that there is a litany of evils that one could see that seems to pose problems for the evidential argument, namely that this seems to be existence of God. But the problem I see with that particular response is that in saying that, you're assuming that removing a particular evil somehow would improve the grand total of the sum of all evil in the universe, or make it lesser. So my question is, how can you make the claim that removing some particular evil, for example, that removing a particular evil in this universe would actually equate to a grand sum total positive result in the grand scheme of history?
Well, yeah, any reduction of suffering that's unnecessary for anyone to make a moral choice would do exactly that. So there's the famous example of Bambi burning to death in the forest, where there will be no remains and no one will ever know what happened, and no one will be able to respond or react to it in any way. But that suffering of that fawn in that burning forest, God could remove it and the world would be better, right? We know things like this happen, and we know things like this happen, even the ones that we're not aware of. So the world could be better, just like that. We know that it's not, though.
Okay, but the thing is, forest fires are really important for regrowth, right?
Sure.
So are you saying that either
Just don't burn any deers unnecessarily.
So are you saying he should intervene and move all the deers away from...
That's what you would expect if you believed in God, which I don't. I have no expectations. It's incumbent upon me to use my wildlife care wardens a little more, with a little more verve. They got to get in there and make sure people don't suffer unnecessarily. Instead of praying about it, we'll actually do something about it.
By the way, God sent millions of people to do something about all this evil in the world.
Yeah,
I think we should do something.
He sent them into the land of Canaan to wipe them out. Is that the one you're talking about?
No. But let me take your answer seems, very plausible. Except if you take it to its logical conclusion, then you'd expect that in absolutely every situation where it would be better that one thing happened than another, God would step in and make the better thing happen. But then the world would be a completely different place. We would have no role to play in any of it. It would just happen and God would run the whole show.
That is a terrible slippery slope. There's no reason to think that if you took away childhood cancer, we wouldn't be able to make a moral decision.
No, but
that's ludicrous.
But the principle is the same principle. God could make it better by this.
And
then explain and then do that for every situation in the world. The world would be completely different and God would run the whole.
Absolutely, take those out. Just take those out. It would be better than it is now.
But then why not take the other ones out? And the other ones, and the other ones, and every time I might do something that's less than perfect, God would step in and stop me and make sure I do the best possible thing in every situation, in which case I don't really have a life.
So the fact that you're saying God's, stepping back a little bit, let us kill each other off just so we can kill each other by our own will. What a terrible world. What a terrible conception of the universe.
And the evil is limited, thankfully, by our death, where God can
until you go to hell.
Hi, good day, professors.
But I'll just say, I don't have a good answer to the hell up explanation. I'll just tell you that. Okay.
So I understand that the scope of the debate was sort of within sort of ultimate creator and then not an ultimate creator, and we're trying to avoid, getting specifically Christian or Muslim or what have you. But unfortunately, you both stepped outside of that scope, I feel. So I would actually like to address a problem there, kind of to both, sort of one question to Strand and then one question to Beach. For Professor Strand, I'm wondering, because you mentioned the afterlife, unfortunately, I now have to ask, if there is an afterlife and there's sort of an after this, so when we die, evil ends as you proposed, and I won't even get into hell because we'll just not talk about it. But I'm wondering if the existence of an afterlife in fact diminishes the value of the time that we are alive. So we understand right now that in this room there are sort of thinking, feeling, believing, what have you, organisms, each person with a dignity, each person is incredibly important, all life is sacred. And then we've all sort of heard the unfortunate caveat, maybe in like an action movie or something, where someone's like, kill them all and let God sort them out. And it seems sort of innocent, but it proposes sort of a scary proposition that it doesn't matter right now. Whereas as soon as the afterlife exists, that seems to undermine why we would do what we do. And then I understand that there's like sort of moral reasoning, like try to be the best person, here's the caveats, don't kill each other, all that, but it still seems like, why would we bother trying to advance science or sort of things along those reasons? And then my question to Beach is...
Well, let's answer this one.
Do you want to do that first? Okay, yeah.
Okay. I think relatively speaking, the value of eternity, if you will, being what it is, will mean the total value of what we do here is smaller in the big scheme of things. But remember what I said before about it being known eternally, everything we do here. So I think that it really does matter what we do here and now. And so it has an eternal significance that I don't think it has on atheism. So I think there's something to what you're saying, but in the end, it doesn't mean that what we're doing here is not valuable, for better or worse. It doesn't matter that we do good or evil, and then there's pain and suffering and pleasure. So.
Okay. And I guess I wanted to clarify as well, that's not really, it's coming from the perspective of someone who is, I guess I'm trying to propose that you would feel more motivated to make something out of your life if there wasn't a God. I guess that's what I was trying to propose. Or there wasn't an afterlife.
Okay, I understand that point. I just don't think it actually works that way. I can completely understand an atheist who wants to do the best, do good in the world. No problem, there's lots of that. But it also helps a lot of people who do believe in God say, you know what, this matters eternally. It has a significance, so I'm going to even sacrifice for the greater good because I know that this isn't all I've got.
So what you're trying to say is YOLO, right?
And I guess it's sort of just in a brief counter, if I may, it seems that along the lines of what you're now arguing is that it does help a lot of people, but I would also say that it instantly, on the exact opposite side of the same coin, allows two towers to have planes crash into them. So I see that the argument can be used both ways. That's why I still feel as though without an afterlife, it seems to imply better.
Oh, okay. This is a very important point that Professor Beach brought up about all the evil that's done by people who have believed in God. Okay. What belief do you blame? Do you blame their belief in God, or do you blame the belief that God wants me to kill all these people? Right? It's this conjunction of beliefs that's the problem. And I would say, well, let's not blame the God belief. Let's blame these other beliefs they have about God, which could be very wrong and very evil. So.
Okay, so I would actually be really inclined to agree with you on that point.
Yes, all scriptures that say things like that, we shouldn't pay attention to anymore.
Right, so that's one of my biggest problems, actually, and I would like to, sort of on that note, bring it over to Professor Beach. Because let's say that there's the Christian belief and the Islamic belief are just full of contradictions, and unfortunately they aren't reliable nowadays for decision making, I feel. So, but that doesn't necessarily imply that there shouldn't be a God, and that if there was a God, but God wasn't the God that maybe cared. You said, like, why would you worship that God?
Yeah.
And I agree.
If there was one like that, it would be morally irrelevant. It would be like Epicurus has this concept of a God like that. Right. It's a perfect circular orbit between galaxies. Okay, great. Yeah, there is one. Who cares?
Okay, good. Okay. That works for me, actually.
So I have a thought that I would be interested in hearing both of you respond to. I wasn't actually able to hear 100% of the debate, so sorry if this has already been addressed. But a lot of the debate that I heard focused around evidence and given a certain hypothesis, what evidence would you expect? I think that most people who believe in God and believe that He loves us also believe that that type of God would give us free will. That type of God would allow us the option of believing in Him or not. So, if God were to provide irrefutable evidence that He did exist, then it would not give us the option. So,
why is that?
Well, assuming...
I know my dad exists. He can tell me to do things, and I can still decide whether to follow him. It doesn't make it more free for me to do or not do what my dad asked if he hides in the back room my whole childhood. Okay? So he can make himself immediately present and say, I want you to do this, and I can say, sorry, Pops, I'm not doing it. God could come down today and say, you need to really treat homosexuals a lot worse than you are, and I could say, no, thank you. That might be in your plan, not in mine.
Right, no, you can choose not to listen to him, but you can't choose not to believe that he exists.
Right, so why would a God put me in that position? That's a weird question. Like, I might exist or not, I'll leave it up to you, but then I'll put you in hell if you don't. Well, that just seems so weird to me. Like, who would do that to someone they loved?
Well, I don't think that 100% of theists think that you automatically go to hell just for not believing
Well,
in God. Some of them do.
Even if I might, that's a bridge too far for me.
I guess you've already responded to my thought, but I guess I was just thinking that to complete the original thought that I had, if I assume a omnipotent, omnibenevolent God, then the evidence that I would expect wouldn't be irrefutable evidence that he existed. It would be precisely what we have, a moderate amount of vague, open to interpretation evidence, because he wants to give us the option.
To not believe that he exists. That's the option you're laying out here.
Well, I think that there is enough evidence to, that maybe you should, but you're not forced to.
It's like giving a final exam, maybe. Like, I just want to see who shows up for it. There might be one, but I'm not going to tell you because I want you to freely choose to write that final exam. No, that's not good. But go ahead.
Well, that's a good response, but yeah.
So if I could weigh in here, I think it is not realistic at all what you're saying. If God appeared to you and said, this is what I want you to do,
He did it to
bearing
Moses.
in mind who God is, I don't think anything you would respond anywhere like that. I don't think you would have any such ability to just say no to such a God, being that clear. I also think that, how God relates to us doesn't have just to do with our rationality. Think about this. Suppose God exists. Would God set things up in such a way that the people who could relate best to God would be the smartest people in the world who could figure it out? That would be the criterion? No, I don't think God would do it that way.
Okay, wait. You're saying if God was present to you, you couldn't make your own decisions? Like immediately present?
Yes, if you knew perfectly well.
And that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing.
Yes.
Okay, so the afterlife must terrify you. Because that's your vision of the afterlife. You're going to be in the presence of God and therefore no longer able to make any decision whatsoever.
And everything that I
Terrifying.
will have fallen in love with will be real.
Like cats?
Like God.
Okay.
And everything good.
Firefly and cats. Okay.
Except for those of them that you love that ended up in hell. They're not going to be with you. Keep forgetting this.
You can wave down at me.
Why do we seem to take it for granted that suffering is the worst thing that could possibly happen to anyone? For both of you, I guess, because in my mind, the worst part of evil things aren't evil because they hurt people, they're evil because inside the person, they make the person who does them not care as much as they did before, I think. So I'm wondering, why are we assuming that suffering is necessarily bad?
So you would rather spend time with someone who hurt you than someone who didn't pay attention to you at all? I'm going to go with suffering on this one. I'm going to double down on suffering. Suffering's bad, uncontroversially bad. Not caring could have many causes, like they just weren't aware.
But she didn't say that suffering isn't bad. She said, why do we assume that it's the worst thing? And I don't think it is the worst thing. And I think this is significant that suffering can be used to make us better people and actually improve our character. And I think actually God cares most about who we are in the end and what we become.
Yeah, you can use a spoon to dig a hole, but you should probably use a shovel. I'm not saying you can't learn by suffering, but if you can learn by educating, let's go that route first. Right? Let's leave the suffering out if we can.
You're not going to learn to empathize with people who are suffering unless you've experienced it.
That's precisely the theory of catharsis, right? We can watch the movie and learn not to hurt people. We don't actually have to hurt people or be hurt.
So life should be a movie where nothing really is happening. We're just
should be
observing
using movies
things.
better, yeah, that's true.
Okay. So, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Now we're all both quaking in our shoes because we have a professional at the mic.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to make actually a comment. Since the doctrine of hell came up a few times, speaking as a theologian, I'll just offer 2 points with respect to that. So first of all, you raise the question as evil would continue, but it's important to understand how that doctrine is understood within Christianity. So of course, no Christian understands that God is perpetuating evil by resurrecting people to eternal judgment. So in that sense, that would sort of be a misfire as an objection. But even perhaps a more important and salient point to make is that Christians disagree on how to understand posthumous judgment. So I take it that the objection you're raising is focused on eternal conscious torment, that God resurrects people and they will suffer eternally in punishment for the choices they've made in this life. And that's only one understanding of the afterlife and posthumous judgment within the Christian tradition. There are other views. Well, so there are annihilationists, for example. They believe people are resurrected to annihilation. They cease to exist because they refuse to be reconciled to God, who is understood to be the source of all goodness. And even universalism, or a hopeful universalism, is a view that dates back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Christian church. You have people like Origen and a fellow named Gregory of Nyssa, who was one of the founders of Christian Trinitarian orthodoxy in the 4th century, who believed ultimately in the afterlife all people would be reconciled to God. And there are not only philosophical arguments for that, there are also many scriptural arguments for that. So I have many Christian friends who are universalists who believe ultimately that all people will be reconciled to God. And I would simply offer that as a reminder that your objection to eternal conscious torment is not an objection to Christianity per se, let alone to theism.
But wouldn't you have to reject like things that Jesus actually says to run that? Like
No,
the gnashing of teeth is not, maybe that is gentle, I don't know, but it doesn't sound like it.
No, you actually have to take the time to do your exegesis, to do your interpretation of the biblical
Right, to
text.
rationalize so it doesn't say something terrible. I get that, but that's but that's kind of disingenuous, isn't it?
No, you actually have to take the time to read what he said within historical context and understand it. So
Or he could have just been
example-
clearer, like you think God could just explain it clearly.
Well, that's another question, is to raise an objection of lack of clarity in Revelation. That's a whole nother topic that you could have. But you want to take, for example, Matthew 25, 41 and 46. Many people go to where Jesus says that the goats will be resurrected to eternal punishment. The Greek word there, we get the word eon, or a long period of time. It's not necessarily referring to forever. It could be referring to an indiscriminately long period of posthumous punishment. And if you reject retributive punishment, if you believe the punishment is for reformation, to bring people into a point of repentance and restoration with those they've offended, then that's what a Christian universalist would believe, and that significantly responds to the moral objection to the doctrine of hell on the basis of retributive eternal punishment.
Fair enough, but my question was to refute Dr. Brand's claim that when we die, that suffering ends. If you still believe in that, you're still believing there's still a period of suffering even after we die. So it refutes your claim.
Well,
So it's cold comfort is the claim.
yeah. So then you would say, well, but my point is that there are Christians for whom that wouldn't be a problem, because ultimately, yeah. So the point is that it's an objection to those Christians, not to Christianity. Just like in philosophical naturalism, so most atheists these days are naturalists. There are certain objections that pertain to certain versions of naturalism and other objections that simply are not relevant. And you simply need to be clear that you can't broad brush either all versions of naturalism or all versions of Christianity. Anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. I should, more carefully, I should have said the suffering of this world ends, and then we could talk about that. But why don't we just say one more question, because we're pretty much out of time.
Okay, my question is for Professor Beach. If God did exist, what evidence would you expect to see?
Well, prayer should work, for one. Right? I mean, right? Like that seems obvious to me. 100% of prayers should always work. Well, all the good ones. All the ones that he thinks are good. Maybe he does answer all those. But I've never, like, if he's healing a knee pain, there's an issue. That's a problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks for engaging me here.